Thanks for tuning in to the Animal Control Report podcast, where we help debunk the dog catcher stereotype. A lot of times people think it's the dog catcher when they hear about animal control officers, but here on the Animal Control Report, we change that by taking you inside the day-to-day operations of animal control officers. Not only will you hear stories of animal control officers, but you'll hear from industry experts as well. We are also part of the Keep It Humane podcast network. We have some amazing partners there, so check them out at keepithumane.com/podcast network. You can listen to all the animal control and animal welfare related podcasts there, and let's continue to help people help animals.
Welcome to an episode of the Animal Control Report with your hosts. Oh, wait, it's just me today. Wow, this is a first in a long time. That's just been me and none of the Ashley Bishops. So big shout out to both Ashley and Ashley who are handling some business today. We are excited to have our guest that we're going to jump into some really good animal welfare topics here in a second. But before we do, please check out our Facebook page and Instagram, all the socials. You can either find us under Keep It Humane and or the Animal Control Report. Also, don't forget, this is like last minute, please vote for your agency or ACO of the year. So that closes November 17th. So please make sure you get that in, and you can do that right at keepithumane.com/awards. We really just want to highlight all the great work some of the ACOs and the agencies are doing this year. And so it doesn't take much. Just go on the website, type a few things, hit the submit button, and then we'll review it and announce that. Our first show of 2025, which will be, I think it's like January 4th or something. So not as cool as July 4th, but pretty cool. If you win, it's pretty cool. Our next guest, or our guest, because apparently I haven't won today, so it's just me. It's different hosting a podcast by yourself, Kristen, but let's...
I'll do my best to help you keep it lively.
Thank you, Kristen Hassen. Is it Hassen? Hassan?
Yeah.
Everyone says it differently.
I know.
Kristen Hassen with Outcomes Consulting. You may know her name if you pay attention to the news or animal welfare, because your name's all over the place right now. And I just wanted to welcome you onto the Animal Control Report. You and I have chatted a few times before, but now we have an opportunity on this platform to discuss kind of the future of animal welfare, not just in Southern California, but I think at least nationwide.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
We're excited, and I know both Ashleys are bummed that they don't get to ask you some of the questions, but they may be texting me during our show just to jump in with some things. So
sounds good.
So just talk to us about, I think we'll just start with the big news and the Riverside contract. So when people see that on a news channel, they're like, whoa, wait, what? Someone's getting $2.5 million to be a consultant. Can you walk us through what that looks like and maybe clarify some of what we don't see behind the scenes?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for asking that. I think when I see that number, I'm like, oh gosh, that's a big number. And I came up with that, we came up with the plan for Riverside. I've been working with them for about 1.5 years. And we just could not get real change made. The staff, top to bottom, the volunteers, that community, they love pets. They're it's a giant place. It's one of the largest counties in America. They have 4 shelters, but it is a tough job. And so I knew it wasn't going to take just me, but people who really are other seasoned experts in the field to help them over a sustained period of time. So we have 2 years with them. And I think when people think about consultancy, they think about somebody like me popping in, writing a report that nobody probably ever reads. And then everybody goes back to regular life and not a lot changes. And really with what this is it's a much more sustained, dedicated effort. It's more than half of my time next year will be taken up with this, as well as a number of staff members that I'll be bringing with me from Outcomes. And the goal is not to, the Riverside folks, there's actually a real deep experience in that group, but they need more gas in the tank. They need more experience, expertise to help them, because it is a very complex set of problems. Their biggest challenge is that 3 of their facilities are located quite far from an adopter base, yet have the most highly adoptable animals. Most people would pay for the animals that are in those shelters. So that's kind of a conundrum with the challenges of transport. So this money will not just go to pay for the staff that'll be working on the project over 2 years, but also we're bringing in Dr. Levy, Kitten Coalition, Marnie Russ, who does incredible work with kittens, and other experts in the field to really re-look at the challenge of one of the biggest shelter systems in the country, and one with historically one of the highest euthanasia rates of shelters on record.
So what I'm hearing is you don't get to pocket the whole 2.5.
No.
Like it's going to a team of people that are going to come in with you and help really maybe just evaluate how things are going there. And for people that may not know, like I want to just pause really quick for some of our listeners. You're currently in Texas, right?
Yes.
Just guessing. Yeah. So like we know Texas is big. Well, California is big too. And Riverside is like just outside of LA. If you think about it, if you're like looking at it on a map, it's like a long rectangle. And it's about 2.5 million people. And here's the big part. It's 7,200 square miles. Like this county is humongous. I know they say everything is bigger in Texas, but Riverside is huge, and it has a very diverse community.
It does. And I think the point about the size of it is one real challenge. And they don't just handle cats and dogs. Their animal control unit is incredible. They do such cool work. They were just telling me this morning, this weekend, they had a pony in a well in a very rural community, and they thought the pony was down 20 feet. And when they started to dig out the well, the pony was 60 feet down. 60 feet. And they saved that pony. So that's going to be on social media in the next couple of days. But when I go there are all kinds of wildlife. The county's not only huge, it's home to a huge diversity of wildlife, farmed animals, etc. It also has a high number of hoarding cases. So they're just dealing with every animal issue you can imagine over a vast amount of land. It's the size of some small states. So there aren't easy answers. And I think that's part of the challenge of the next couple of years. Is I couldn't walk in and say they need to do all of these things and it's going to be fixed. It's really going to take a rethinking of the system, how it should function, and really they're juggling this thing. I think a lot of communities are, where how much do we invest in the community side and how much do we invest in the shelters? And with the limited budget, they're always having to make decisions that will pull away from something else. So that's also one of the conundrums we're going to try to help them solve.
What, like from just looking at it from maybe your perspective, like what did you know about it prior to even entertaining? Like, I don't know how that process, I mean, I kind of have an idea how the process works to seek, if you will, consulting, but like, was it on your radar prior to that, I guess would be my question.
It was. Places like Riverside and Bakersfield, they don't get talked about as much as communities like LA or even Oakland, but they are kind of the country mouse cousins to the city mouses that are the big cities, yet they deal with such a diversity of problems. I think that's an important point you just made. And so I knew about Riverside because of the high intake and the high euthanasia rates. But when I went in, I think I saw the first year we really spent solving problems that they could solve. So I'm really excited I don't think we've announced this yet, but I brought Dr. Hurley, Dr. Levy, Jackson Galaxy, Hannah Shaw. We all went to Riverside in January because they had the highest cat and kitten euthanasia rate of any shelter on record for 2023. And we launched the 5,000 cat challenge, which was an attempt to reduce cat and kitten euthanasia by 5,000 over 2024. And we are more than 80, we're about 80%, we're about 4,200 fewer euthanasias of cats and kittens. They've started a kitten foster program. Thanks to Hannah, they have really gone all in on TNR, SNR, and helping people, helping regular people who find kittens foster them and care for them until they're old enough to be adopted. So that's the kind of work we've been able to do. So some of the more solvable problems we've tackled, and now we're kind of digging into the ones that are a little bit more sticky.
And I think we both know how this industry, it's not black and white. And I think we make it black and white with that 90% live release rate. And here's why I say that. Because I've been trying to understand where it came from. And I've asked many people. We've reached out to Nathan Wintergrad. We got denied. He did not have time or want to come on the show to discuss it. And so I'm just curious, like, where that came from your opinion, what analytics supported it, because I feel that puts us in that aspect when we talk about it. None of us, and let me throw that out there with the caveat, none of us want to euthanize. And I'm sure same for Riverside, though they had high numbers. Maybe they just didn't have the support, the structure, the ability to save more animals. So why 90%? Do we know, like, do you know where it came from?
I think that if we'd have to go back to some of the early no-kill history with people like Rich Avanzino, who, was the first, I think, director of Maddie's Fund. Maddie's Fund probably, Mary Smith probably knows more about this than almost anyone at this point who leads Maddie's Fund. But I think, I came back into sheltering in about 2012. And at the time, we were euthanizing so many animals. Like, I had learned in the 90s. So I had started in 99. And like, euthanasia was the norm. It was like, if you're under 4 months or over 4 years, you're going to be euthanized. Like, I actually started in humane law enforcement in Ohio. I think every animal in the time I worked there that I brought back to the shelter was euthanized. I can't think of one that was saved. And those days were brutal. Like, those of us that started then, and I think we kind of it became normal. Just euthanasia became the normal solution. And when I went back, I was in Fairfax County, and 90% for me, I actually feel like it was important because it was like, I knew that bar was possible. It like became this thing of like, this is actually possible. So what could you do to get there? And I think 90% probably was very arbitrary. It was probably selected from smaller shelters who were accomplishing that, who said we can do this. And I think as like a sort of as a guide for someone like me that was used to euthanizing as the norm, it was very helpful. And in those days, I mean, Nathan Wintergrad at one point was a mentor of mine, and people really feel, and I think he's become incredibly divisive. And so I don't have a relationship with him any longer, but I remember at the time, people like him, people like Dr. Jefferson, they would challenge me to like, okay, you have this cat with FIV. Why is this cat being euthanized? And that all those challenges brought us to this point. And I had no kill on my name for many years, but I think we're at a point in the movement where it is just, with the kind of advocacy we're seeing on social media, people don't know what it means. They're not going to, it's a misnomer. And I understand why we're at this point where it's like, yeah, this 90% bar, this no kill language, it kind of confuses the issue, to your point. It goes back to my thing about like, do you put more into the community or the animals in the shelter? But I do think it's important. I don't think we should throw away the whole thing, the whole idea of some bar, because I've also worked with shelters as a consultant where they are just euthanizing like as practice. Like they don't have any, it's not like, I'm not speaking about the will of the people there, but they're so used to doing what I used to do in the 90s.
Sure.
Where, they're like, why wouldn't we euthanize that puppy? Like, that puppy's going to grow up to become a dog and we don't need more dogs. So I think there's some value in like affirming that life-saving is an important part of our work. But I agree with you. It's very, very challenging.
And my point to even bring it up this early was it shouldn't be used as a measuring stick to determine if a shelter is good or bad. That's where I feel the community, and as you said, the divisive language. If a shelter's sitting at 80%, but they have all these programs in place, they're investing in their community by trying to have low-cost spay-neuter clinics or provide access to care in that way. Are they not just as successful as somebody and that's hitting 90%? And as you said, those metrics come from I worked for a small shelter where we didn't even have strays. We had to like bus them in from the tribal lands. Truthfully, is we didn't have access to any pets, and so the euthanasia rate was a non-issue. How
Can
do
I ask
we?
you a question? Can I
Yeah,
ask you a question about this? Because I think about this all the time. And I think
sure,
I was in Pima, 20,000 intake, only a million people, 9,000 square miles.
sure.
And we saved more than 90% of the animals for, oh gosh, they're running on 10 years now. And we did it. We also increased public safety, reduced bites, increased community services, and I believe provided generally humane care. But the investment the community was making, they were very aware of that. Like they were very aware that as a community, they wanted to put the resources in. We had massive volunteer programs. And do you remember with the Silomar? I mean, I think when we go back to the Silomar, there was this thing of like, what does the community want?
Hmm.
And that piece we're missing now. Like in some places in rural Texas, the community may say it's not feasible for us, and this is what the community decides. But I think we're missing that connection, right? Like communities
Yeah,
have to make decisions about what they're going to prioritize.
I think that's extremely valuable, and that's where I think that's where we can't use it as a single measuring stick for everyone. Whereas Riverside is going to be a completely different community than Pima was, or LA City is going to be extremely different than San Diego was. I will say that like I was blown away where I've worked at an agency where we were euthanizing cats because they didn't want to they didn't want to treat ringworm, Kristen. We're talking ringworm. I can't even say the word. Like that blew my mind. But that's just the reality that we're in. And I think we have to find ways to again be involved and engage the community and listen to what they feel is best. And I think most people in the community are always going to highlight public health and safety in the aspects of what that does. And that's the scary piece for me is, here in California, they have Hayden's Act or Hayden's Law, which I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with since you'll be coming to California. And it can become worrisome when some of these dogs go back in the community. We saw it recently in LA County, where they just settled for $7 million on someone that was severely injured by a dog. Um, and that one's a little murky as far as information, prior history being released on the animal, etc. I hope we don't sacrifice our public health and safety just to hit a benchmark that is arbitrary, like you said. So
Yeah, I was so worried about, I was on a working group with Ian Dunbar, Dr. Sagerson, a number of vet behaviorists trying to redefine the bite scale because the bite scale, the Dunbar bite scale, and I mean, Ian Dunbar says this himself. Like, I think he's not entirely comfortable with it at this point. But I do think we need what we were building at the time and what we have yet to release, I think, for fear that it would be misused. It's not uncomplicated. Was a radar chart to look at circumstances of bites, severity, number of bites, proximity of the victim, age of the victim. Like, we don't have a very sophisticated way to look at truly dangerous animals. And it worries me that animals that have committed serious acts of harm, particularly big dogs that are very capable of doing it again, and that there isn't any criteria for those dogs. We really do need to continue that conversation because the last thing that we want to see is an animal that we know will harm someone going back in the community and doing it again. Like that was preventable. So I worry about that as well.
and when you talk about the bite scale, some of the people that may be listening might not be familiar with it. And so I'll just let them know that we've actually had, if you go back in the archives, we've had Dr. Ian Dunbar on the show years ago. He's a veterinarian and a behaviorist. And in that bite scale, it's kind of twofold. It talks about severity based on a scale of 1 through 6, and we don't need to break it down entirely. But in addition to the severity, just the type of bite, then he also talks about bite inhibition and rehabilitation from a behavioral standpoint if the animal's safe in the community. So it's kind of twofold. It gives you a scale of how severe is the bite, and then is this animal essentially placeable in that aspect. As we transition and talk about like, I don't even want to jump into the future yet. I want to talk about the now. And so one of the things that I've been on this soapbox is, how do we incentivize, Kristen, responsible pet ownership? How do we say, if you get a pet, you get it spayed, neutered, etc., at the end of the year, because everybody calls them their babies, at the end of the year, when you're doing your taxes, there is some sort of relief for making sure that animal's been to a vet within that 1 year. Um, they are spay or neutered. They have a current rabies vaccination, microchip, etc. Like, how do we get to that level? Just in the simple reason is not obviously creating this environment of like spaying and neutering, but it's also putting animals on a different level than they've ever been, right? They've always been just considered property. And so now that if we see them as part of the family, which most people would agree they are, how do we get there?
Well, I think that I attended the International Companion Animal Management Conference this year. It had 121 countries represented. And to hear the presentations from virtually every non-Western country talk about how they're approaching animal welfare was so vastly different. It blew my mind how much they are putting into tracking data in the community in very sophisticated ways. A lot of these countries have to track data because of rabies.
Mm-hmm.
They have to make sure everybody's rabies vaccinated, sterilized. And then there is so much more emphasis put on humane education in really innovative ways, and bringing people, explaining to people basic tenets of animal care much more proactively. And I think because the US system, for better or worse, is so heavily shelter focused that we've lost some of that because so much of our emphasis is on the shelter. And my take on this is that we actually need two separate agencies for animal services in communities. We need one that focuses on sheltering and an entirely different agency that focuses on animals in the community, because we end up kind of pitting those two things against each other, and they're always fighting each other, right? Like, if we do the community, we're not building a foster program. If we build a foster program, we're not spaying and neutering animals. Now, is that to say that we should be providing all of this for free to everyone? I think I've changed a little bit on that. The US has an extraordinarily high rate of pet ownership relative to many other countries.
Mm.
And it may not be appropriate for everyone to have pets. Like, I think we have to grapple with that. I know that's not popular to say, but people are really struggling. And when you add animals and the complexity of pet ownership into people who are already struggling, like, this kind of messaging we have in the US, like owning a pet is going to heal you no matter what. It's a little bit like, yeah, okay, I get it, but animals are a huge responsibility. And I don't know. I don't think unfunded mandates are helpful. I'm here in Austin where we've had a Emancipet for 15 years. They're doing, like, I don't know, 10 free spay neuter clinics a day for 15 years. And the lines are out the door at 6 a.m. Like, people want the services. Like, there is a limit though to how much, like, we need state and federal funding dedicated to spay and neuter, identification, and vaccination if we're going to expect that from pet owners, because people are broke. They're having trouble feeding themselves. So I don't know. I would say that state and federal funding is probably the most practical thing I could say about it.
We don't have a governing body. If you look at, if you look at puppy mills, they're governed by USDA or APHIS, right? Like, animal welfare, sheltering, animal control, there's no governing body. Who do you think the closest governing body even would be? Because we have those, our big agencies, the acronyms, if you will, like, but outside of, like, who tells us what's right, what's wrong?
I think because animal shelters have never been eligible in large part for state or federal funding.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had state or federal regulation, but I think ideally we'd see a combination of both, and not. I mean, regulation is a hot button issue, gosh, for a day before election, but we don't have any standards of any kind, and those can't be set by a private organization at this point. If you look at, I think VBACS is a great example of a small amount of regulation. It's just a state reporting requirement. That state is so much more functional in terms of statewide animal welfare efforts than almost anywhere. I think Colorado has it as well.
Yeah, Colorado has PACFA, and then what was the one that you mentioned?
Feedbacks, it's Virginia Department of Animal
Okay.
Agriculture, and they have state mandated reporting. And it's simple. It's like start count, intakes, outcomes, end count. And every shelter and rescue reports on it. And you're just the difference working in Virginia from working in somewhere like Texas or California. It's hard to even compare. So yeah, we need regulating bodies to set some standard. And this is coming from someone that sees my like one of the things that's been happening, and I guess I can say this because it's an animal control podcast and people can handle it, is there's really very little training for euthanasia.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm seeing really horrific examples of untrained employees euthanizing animals en masse. There should be some regulation there. Those are the things that keep me up at night, and areas where it's like it's unconscionable that we continue without that.
I mean, I think the standard even has to go further in the aspects like, as we talk about the villainous dog catcher or the the new sitcom Animal Control, where it just portrays animal control as kind of like comedic, aloof, drug using, uneducated fools. The reality is that did not come from some genius sitting in Hollywood that was like, I'm going to create this role of this villain. It came from us. Like, we, for many, many years, and people don't know this. I love the history of this profession. There's a period of time in the early 1800s where they actually had the dog collector. And it was a very barbaric time where dogs specifically, because of rabies, if they were found outside of what was in New York City called the lamppost district, they could be killed just because they're outside of the lamppost district, because of the threat to rabies. And then the dog collector would actually give a bounty per each dog. And so people were actually going around trying to round up strays, if you will, bring them back to the dog collector and get paid on it. And so from there, then you have the dog catcher, and that played a big part. And I mean, it's wild to think about this. I've not been in the industry, of a decade and a half or whatever, right? So it's like, that's not that long. I'm talking, I started in the 2000s, but when I started, there were a few people that I worked with that were sure enough the dog catcher, and told me specifically, like, the reason they even got the job, because it was the next step up from being the garbage person, and they had county benefits, county retirement. They didn't need an education. But I think we're starting to see that shift, whereas the animal control piece is absolutely starting to say, like, well, wait, it's an attractive job. People want to do this type of work. They know that it is rewarding, etc. I think we do need to figure out a way to create standards. If you go back to Henry Berg and the ASPCA and the founding, if you will, of animal law in this country, like, he realized that was a missing link, that there was a piece there that we didn't have. We didn't have the ability to stop the cruel treatment of horses. I mean, that's where it started. And then it then applied to our domestic pets, and then eventually children, which most people don't know came from animal law. And so I think we need to continue to have those conversations as a whole, and then we have to put those egos aside, because the reality is, like, and people know that, like, when I talk about my feelings of that terminology, I think we're somewhat all in agreement that the terminology does more harm than good. The idea or the concepts behind trying to help animals is fine. Like, I'm here for it. I think I'm wearing let me see. If you're watching on YouTube, shout out to Greenville County, South Carolina, love a Chihuahua. Like, they're a great organization that takes a lot of pride in their live release rate. At the end of the day, we're just trying to help our community. And is there, I guess, like, if you had a magic wand, Kristen, if you could say, this is what our profession truly needs, what would it be?
I think that's a great question. And I would say a couple of things. One is that we need a reckoning with our former, present, and future, our former and present roles, and really to come to terms with the expectations we've built in our communities for animal welfare. I think about the idea of sweeps going in and en masse rounding up animals, which is happening pretty frequently now. And I know, there aren't a lot of answers for those animals. They're generally impounded. Their return rate is quite low, but those animals need help. So this gets into this when you get to the heart of managed intake, and I think where we're seeing so much kind of strife in our movement, we need to pull apart the idea of managed intake and not just say it's terrible or it's great. I've seen both sides of it. I think it's both terrible and great, but really look at what's happening, really reconsider what's happening at the point that we meet with the public, whether it's in the field or in the shelter, and say what should be happening at that point. And that is a question we're almost afraid to ask, because I've been on the other end of this advocacy, and like people are like, managed intake, you turn all the animals away and they're in the streets suffering. And in some ways, sometimes that may not be untrue. Like an animal could go back into the community and be hit by a car or suffer. And I also have seen shelters that impound every single animal, and they sit in rooms until they get sick for months, sometimes years, and then they're euthanized. Like I don't think we've really figured that point out, and that point of interface really matters. And I look to orgs worked with Petco Live Lost for a couple of years, and I really love what they do because they're using facial recognition technology. They're inviting people who find stray pets to help get those pets home. Even that gets pushed back. But I think we have to be asking the community for help in different ways than we are now. And when we think about managed intake, we think about the person who needs to surrender their 10-year-old dog and we're turning them away. But when I think about managed intake, I actually think more in terms of stray and lost pets, because those animals are often attached to somebody who cares about them, who has the means to help them, who isn't going to have to keep them forever, but can do something meaningful to help. But we're really afraid to have conversations. And part of that is this advocacy where you've got PETA on one side, you've got Nathan on the other. And what I'm seeing now is that advocacy, it's almost meeting in the middle. Like where PETA used to be on one side and no police on the other, there's this meeting in the middle, and no one even understands what they're criticizing anymore. It's like,
yeah, because they stand so strong on their belief or their ego that they're not willing to have that conversation.
No, and they don't want to think about it. Like they want every animal to come in. They want every animal to receive perfect care, every animal to leave alive, and every animal to go to a home they approve of. And it is not realistic to expect this is possible in our society. It's not possible for children. Why would it be for animals? But we're scared. I'm scared, right? Like I'm reticent to speak openly about complex subjects because the simplistic kind of you're right, I'm wrong advocacy is really hurting us. So I don't have a simple way to say this except that having harder conversations without becoming kind of hateful personally towards each other, we're still not very good at that.
Well, and I'm glad you bring that up because as you know, I'm one to be very candid on this program and or in classes if I teach a class about certain topics. If I'm brought in to talk about smart sheltering or whatever it may be, then I'm going to have a different view or a different, I guess, voice than I would if I'm talking about verbal de-escalation. I will say that I have learned that because of that, because I truly believe that we can help the community without using divisive language, it's made me more polarizing in the industry versus just being agreeable to oh, that's great language or that's great terminology. I think if we really just, like you said, if I mean, I know it's two sides, but if PETA and best friends became friends and then we worked together on really pulling our resources, and that's where I go back to that history, George Thorndike Angel or MSPCA up there in Boston and Henry Berg worked together. So did Caroline Earl White. She was kind of inspired by that work, and they all worked together. Now they had different personalities and egos, but at the same time, they knew that the job was to help the animal aspect. And I always say that help people help animals, because at the end of the day, look, I rescued a little grebe. It's this little bird that lives here in California off of the beach. I can help every animal if I had the time, but that's not going to truly get to the cause of the problem. It's a people problem. It's people being uneducated about access to care, spay and neuter, proper responsible treatment, etc. And so we have to build that relationship not only in our communities that we work in, but the communities that we live in. And that's the whole purpose of the show. One of our listeners sent a message recently that they're not even in the industry, but they really appreciate what we talk about. And then they give their feedback and topics of interest too. So
I want to dig into what you're saying because I think it's important. And I think you're talking about people who were very economically privileged. They were some of the richest people in America at the time. They were forming private nonprofit groups, or what we know as private nonprofits today. And those nonprofits were really they were working sort of in parallel, but in tension with the government shelter. And I think actually at that root is part of the problem today of the highly resourced nonprofit with limited intake and the poor government shelter. Like you and I are like government shelter, has our hearts. And I really struggle with the fact that like we're still living with that legacy too. Like, do you think there's a way to rethink like that nonprofit government shelter thing seems like another real problem we've got to deal with?
So, I mean, again, it comes back to some sort of oversight. But I think it's even bigger than that. I think it's truly getting like a gala like of these folks together in a room and having real conversations and saying, hey, like this isn't about your name or your organization. This is about the animals and the future of animals in this country. And someone was telling me, we had a guest on the show recently that did some work for Shelter Animals Counts, and I think you have a relationship with them too. 20% of animals come from, or 20% of dogs come from shelters. Is that right?
I'm not sure what statistic that they're
Okay. Okay. So like own pets in America, like after I've heard that, after I heard that 20% of owned pets in this country come from animal shelters, when I go to like Dog Beach, it's a off-leash dog park at the beach, and I look around, and the majority are purebreds. Most of them are poodles and golden retriever mixes, but that's still in somebody's mind a purebred. So I think what's happened, Kristen, is we've created these silos in our profession that all have their unique like identity. And behind that identity, if you donate 37 cents a day, you help an animal in the community, but you also help fund this program that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And then there's that identity to it. So I don't know how you switch from an individual identity in a monopoly.
Yeah, I don't either, especially when profit is the driving motivator of a private nonprofit. I mean, the reason that if you work in government sheltering, what is everybody's fighting over the same 10% of your animals, right? They're the ones that can bring it, that can turn a profit.
Sure.
And then the governments are left with those that don't. And that issue, you're right. And I think we've lost ground on pet adoption. I think Adopt Don't Shop was brilliant. It was like probably the smartest thing we've done as a movement. People now today would really resist that. And we know that online sales of puppies are exploding. We don't know how many because it's also not regulated or reported. And so, yeah, we've lost ground on pet adoption. And really, I think what we were doing right was creating this national culture around pet adoption. And some of that has been hurt by, like, as you point out, bad, negative media about animals that shouldn't have been adopted, et cetera. And so I think we have to kind of dive back into that pool and start really trying to re-inspire this national culture, especially among young people. I was looking at, in California, there are so many huskies. Like, you don't even see, like, pit bulls are like, oh yeah, pit bulls are sort of overpopulated. Huskies, it is like nothing you've ever seen. And I was telling this to someone and she was like, well, have you been on TikTok lately? And she sends me a couple pages with like 10 million followers with like telling everyone to get a husky. I don't know how, in the context that we're living in, how do we try to get those people to adopt our huskies? I'm not really sure, but we're in a new terrain that I feel a little bit like we're on some unsteady footing here.
I think I agree with that. And I think you hit on a couple of things that I want to make sure we don't kind of gloss over. you and I, we've been in this industry for a long time, so we're kind of jaded by it. But if I'm my neighbor or somebody that doesn't know it, and I read an article that a dog adopted from a shelter killed a child or mauled somebody, etc., I may be less likely to then go and try to find my pet from an animal shelter because I don't know anything about it. It's like going to get a used car and not doing the Carfax, which leads me into a whole nother topic about microchipping, but we can get into that later. Um, if you think about like, we have to find a way, and I hate to use this analogy, but I don't know how else to use it. We have to find a way to get on the same status. And forgive me if you're a firefighter. What 9/11 did to firefighters in this country was it was an epic turn. Though they were never seen negatively, they became the hero that everybody wanted to make sure that they were thanking when they saw them in their community. Like, because we saw the hard work that they did. We were like, oh my God, these guys were going into these buildings, like that, all that stuff. People don't see the hard, they still think what goes on in the shelter were the pound, right? One of the things I've said this for a long time now, and this is anyone that works kennels, that's got to be one of the most physically and mentally draining jobs that you could ever do in this country. You're literally not only on your feet all day, moving animals. Now you're forming relationships with some of these pets, these animals that are leaving for multiple reasons. They may leave because they're getting adopted, so that's a good news. Yay, great win. And then some may leave because the euthanasia aspect of it. And so such a hard job, and it's so undervalued and we're underpaying there. And then we get people in those positions that may not be passionate about it because it pays $16 an hour, and they're just like, I'll do it, versus like really trying to find people that want to come in and care for those animals. So it's like, I don't know, like if you want to go be a nurse, you got to go to school, you got to get all that stuff, like, and then you got to take care of people in the hospital, etc. I think we need to raise our standards, and then from there, we have to have some oversight, whether it's stateside or federally, and then, but we have to remember this, and this is what I say to people all the time. This is kind of my new shtick: is our profession is so unique in the aspects of either you're involved directly or indirectly by being able to either reunite a lost family member to that home. So a dog that went missing 6 weeks ago, you were part of that process to get it back and get it back to the home. And now you're creating a core memory for that family that is going to stick with them for the rest of their life. Or you're placing literally a brand new family member with a home, with a family that might actually like be with that family the whole time this child is growing up to when they go to college, and it's eventually going to turn into a tattoo on somebody, right? Like that's what typically happens is you're part of this, you're part of like such an amazing, rewarding type of thing where you're creating such an impact on people's lives. It's just the community doesn't see it for that. We're still living in the shadows of the dog pounds, which it's only 200 years ago, but we need to find ways to really campaign out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of my soapbox there.
Hmm.
So at the end of the day, I mean, it's, hats off to the people doing the good work. We really appreciate like the hard work that goes on. We know what goes on behind those lines. We just still have to try to advocate for each other, and hopefully some of these bigger orgs can kind of come together and help us reach that goal. I do think legislation would help though.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I guess the last thing I'll say is that anytime we are coming up with an answer that's too simple or too black and white, we're wrong. And I think like if I had any advice to give people in this movement on all sides, it's that like simplistic advice isn't correct because every animal and every person is an individual. And we've got to start grappling with that and taking lessons from human welfare, taking lessons from community health, and really reconsidering our role in all of this. I think animal services agencies are being asked increasingly to do an impossible impossible amount of work. We're set up for failure. We need to organize collectively for workers' rights within animal welfare. I was at a shelter recently where every animal caretaker cleans. On the day I was there, they were each responsible for 150 double-sided dog kennels, cleaning and feeding. They couldn't use any cleaning products. They couldn't have possibly gotten through those animals. And like, if we think about organizing workers, we need standards if for no other reason, we are killing people. And the longer I do this, I've worked in virtually every big city now. I have not worked in El Paso. I want to say that I hear sometimes about my work in El Paso.
Wait, isn't there a whole page about your work?
I've never worked in El Paso. No, it's one city I've never worked in. But you would think that I lived there.
It's because Haas was there, right? That's why.
Yeah, and oh God, that's one thing we didn't talk about. But I think that in these cities, you see what workers are being expected to do, and it's not, we can't continue to treat people this way. Like, we have got to do something for workers. And I stay tuned for that, because I think I'm working with a few folks who are actively thinking about how to protect frontline workers that intake, animal care, vet techs, animal control officers.
Yeah, they need it. I think it's amazing work that we do, and it's sometimes not protected in the aspects where it should be. So thank you for thinking about them, because those are the ones that are going to, that's what I say too to people. Like, you could either be that nameless gray face, which is okay. There's no issue with it, where it's just like, I blend in and I do my job. Or you could be that next Caroline Earl White, right? Or you could be that next Henry Berg or whoever. Like, you have that ability to take it to the next level if you really want. And that's where we have to just be really looking for people and trying to help maybe bring them to that next level, because there's some really amazing people in this profession. And I'm just grateful. I'll just say that I'm grateful for the opportunities that I've been given. And I'm just grateful that I'm still here, because I love this type of work. And I want to continue to, as we say on the show, help people, help animals.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for answering all the hard questions. And again, please check out our website. That's keepithumane.com. Don't forget to cast your nominations for ACO and Agency of the Year. And it feels weird because I don't have my co-host with me, but I have to do it anyway. Keep it humane.